All right, YouTube, it's time to weigh in over this Cliven Bundy rancher business that's going on down in Nevada because we've had new developments here. First, last night, several militia groups, citizens militias in Nevada actually essentially said to mobilize and head for the ranch, which means there are probably going to be hundreds or thousands of armed individuals. Some of these people are veterans and former agents themselves, headed to this location to back up this rancher that's being supposedly mistreated by the federal government. I'm going to give a little bit of analysis here myself because actually there is something in this causes me to side more with the rancher, more than anything else that I've seen, more than just like, well, it's been in my family for a century or whatever. That's good. That causes me to feel sympathy for him. But this particular article, which is from Wikipedia, on the specific desert tortoise that is mentioned by the Bureau of Land Management, this is sort of the nail in the coffin of the Fed argument on this issue. Somebody pointed this out on 4chan's politics page. I know you're not really supposed to talk about it openly with, new friends or so forth. I don't give a shit. Someone pointed this out, that it isn't actually about the tortoises. The Bureau of Land Management, in levying these fines, impounding the cattle, and putting these agents there, scaring the shit out of his family, are saying, well, we're trying to protect this endangered desert tortoise habitat. However, the Bureau of Land Management itself is overseeing 1.8 million acres of developed land in Nevada and Arizona and all of these other places. There's a link to the Wikipedia article about this particular tortoise. The Bureau of Land Management itself is taking hold of this land to allow for projects for solar and wind expansion. Now, I support solar and wind. I think it's a great idea. It weans us off fossil fuels. It's great. I think you should mount the solar panels on existing structures so as not to take up more room, but, it's, apples and oranges here. However, the Ivanpah solar power project that concerns us here in this specific location, I'll go through this and read some of it, link in the description. Concerns about the impacts of the Ivanpah solar thermal project led the developers to hire some 100 biologists and spend $22 million caring for tortoises on or near the site during construction. This is near this ranch. Despite this, in a 2011 revised biological assessment for the Ivanpah solar electrical generating system, the Bureau of Land Management anticipated the loss or significant degradation of 3,520 acres of tortoise habitat and the harm of 57 to 274 adult tortoises, 608 juveniles, and 236 eggs inside the work area, and 203 adult tortoises, 1,541 juvenile tortoises outside the work area. The BLM expects that most of the juvenile tortoises on the project will be killed. So essentially, these tortoises that they're using as a sort of smokescreen for why they're going in and taking his cattle and fining him and saying, you've got to get off this land, the same tortoises that they're worried about, that they're using as an excuse to move in, are going to be killed anyway because this same chunk of land is slated to be developed for solar management. So when the feds come out and say, well, this is about the tortoises, think about the turtles or whatever, they themselves do not care about these tortoises because their ongoing activities will lead to the development of this chunk of land, among others, and destroy that habitat anyway. And by the way, as somebody who is reasonably versed in agriculture and ecology and so forth, I can tell you right now that ranching this land, letting free-range cattle, a few hundred of them, graze this land, is not going to desertify and destroy this area. And it will not leave it more fire-prone. That is a lie. That is false. In this area, you have old growth, which is fire-prone. If the cattle move in, they begin to renew the biomass in the soil. They take existing dry, withered old plants and convert them into new, greener, fresher, less fire-prone plants. You see this in action. Here in Vermont is a great example. Vermont was largely old-growth forests until the early part of the 1900s. It was heavily forested, and it was fire-prone because a lot of these trees were dead and decayed, and anytime you had a drought, you would have forest fires. They cut almost all of the green wood off of Vermont for cattle grazing and for sheep because they had a textile industry at the time. Lo and behold, no more fires. Now it's all new growth, because most of it was stripped off and continued to be stripped until about the 50s or 60s. It's fairly new growth around here. When people come and gawk at our forests, they say, oh, how beautiful the forests are. Well, if you had come here a century ago, it would be mostly very creepy old trees with lots of dead branches. It would have been completely different than what you're used to when you vacation in Vermont. Note to the people from the nanny states around D.C. and to the rich New Yorkers that come here and spend tens of millions of dollars a year. Thank you for your money, but you can go home now. These tortoises are not the reason for the feds moving in. They want him off of this land so they can continue with their solar development. Here's another article. This will be in the description as well. I know it's from Fox News. Sue me, but they're the only mainstream outlet that is covering this so far. Once shots are fired, I'm sure that everyone else will pile on board and say how terrible this rancher was and how he was a gun-toting racist lunatic. Nevada officials blast feds over treatment of cattle rancher Cliven Bundy. Well, I'm not fucking surprised. He's an old man. He wants to raise his cows. He's not going around playing cowboy and shooting prairie dogs. He's a rancher. He's not some clueless hick redneck in Arkansas with an AK-47 collection. He's a rancher. He wants to raise his cattle on this land that has been in his family or used by his family, which is public land, by the way, and until they declared it habitat for these tortoises, nobody cared when he grazed it. They didn't charge him anything. He grazed it. Nobody cared. And there were other ranchers who did the same, and then they forced everyone except for him out, and now they're finding him and showing up with snipers and so forth, sort of a Waco-style situation. Two of Nevada's top elected leaders are riding to the rescue of a rancher whose decades-long range war with the federal government has reached a boiling point in recent days. The Federal Bureau of Land Management has surrounded the Clark County ranch of Cliven Bundy with armed officers, helicopters, and four-wheel drive vehicles. See, they've called in basically this massive SWAT team for a rancher and his small family who haven't threatened anybody. The son got thrown in jail for filming these officers, which is ridiculous. Last week, they began seizing cattle found grazing on adjacent federal lands in violation of a law meant to protect an endangered desert tortoise. Well, again, they don't care about the tortoises because those tortoises are going to die anyway. They simply want to develop this land for their energy projects. Well, bravo for being for green energy. I am too, but this is one rancher. He's got a few hundred cattle. Even if you built these windmills, what the hell is a cow going to do to hurt a windmill? It makes no sense whatsoever. The windmill, what, 100 feet tall? Is the cow going to suddenly start flying and get lodged in the spokes of this windmill? It doesn't make any sense. Both Governor Brian Sandoval and Senator Dean Heller have condemned the BLS for what they characterize as heavy-handed actions involving Bundy and other Silver State residents. Well, yeah, it looks exactly like the Waco siege that we all got to see on TV many years ago back in the 90s. It looks exactly the same. The only difference being the Branch Davidians actually were heavily armed and did have a fortified compound. You can say that the feds acted inappropriately, but they were firing back. This rancher hasn't done anything. He's just saying, nope, ain't going to pay the fine. I'm going to keep grazing my cows. He's not, patrolling the edge of his property with a machine gun. He hasn't done anything other than illegally graze his cows on land that's going to be destroyed anyway by a wind project. No cow justifies the atmosphere of intimidation which currently exists, nor the limitation of constitutional rights that are sacred to all Nevadans, Sandoval, a Republican, said. The BLM needs to reconsider its approach to this matter and act accordingly. I would agree with that. Heller, also a Republican, said he told BLM Director Neil Corns the situation is being handled poorly. I told him very clearly that law-abiding Nevadans must not be penalized by an overreaching BLM. It is overreaching when you think about it because these are not federal lands per se. These are public lands. Nobody cared what anybody did on this land until they wanted wind turbines and solar cells. And then it became an important habitat for tortoises that are going to go extinct in this location anyway after they are built. It's ridiculous. And then he goes on to compare it to Waco, which is an apt comparison, I have to say. This is a lot bigger deal than just my cows, Bundy told FoxNews.com. It's a statement for freedom and liberty in the Constitution. Well, you may think that's a little bit overblown, but in a way he is right. His cows are not damaging this land. Any first-year ecology student can tell you this is not going to lead to some sort of massive degradation of this tortoise habitat, especially when these tortoises are slated to die anyway at the hands of the feds, who are going to replace their cactuses and sagebrush with windmills. The fight involves a 600,000-acre area under BLM control called Gold Butte, near the Utah border. The vast and rugged land is the habitat of the protected desert tortoise, and ranchers whose cattle graze there must pay fees. Bundy, a descendant of Mormons who settled in Bunkerville more than 140 years ago, claims an inherent right to graze the area and casts the conflict as a states' rights issue. Again, kind of right, because this is within Nevada. And certain states also, this is something that isn't quite clear and is slightly confusing. In certain states, if you are making use of land for an extended period of time to the exclusion of all others that may claim title, after a certain period of time, you actually do inherit that land legally. You can actually file papers for it. Here in Vermont, I know that's the case. I think it's like 10 or 20 years. Basically, the idea is if you're squatting on property and maintaining it, even if it's somebody else's property at the time, if they're not making any use of it, it becomes yours after a time, if you can prove that you were there. Well, nobody's claiming otherwise, that his family hasn't been here for over a century. Technically, according to some legal frameworks, technically that makes this entire 600,000-acre area, or whatever he happens to be grazing within it, his. I'm not sure if that is the case in Nevada, if they've got similar laws. BLM spokeswoman Kirsten Cannon said agents on Saturday and Sunday rounded up 134 of an estimated 900 trespassing cattle. They're not even just cattle, they're trespassing cattle, in a vast 1,200 square mile area of rangeland northeast of Las Vegas and the Lake Mead National Recreation Area. Cannon said the roundup was a last resort and blamed Cliven Bundy for inflammatory statements, including vows to fight and characterizations of the cow removal as a range war. The media's calling it a range war too. That didn't originate with this dude. As for inflammatory statements, which is more inflammatory? Him saying, well, I'm going to fight for my cattle and my land and my constitution, or them sending dozens or hundreds of heavily armed agents in with helicopters and machine guns? One is clearly more inflammatory than the other. Mr. Bundy has been in trespass on public lands for more than 20 years, Cannon said, adding that he owes the federal government some $1.1 million in unpaid grazing fees. Well, nobody cared when he was grazing there before this 1990s-era Tortoise Act. And it's not hurting. The tortoises are still there after over 100 years of grazing there, with potentially in the past even more cattle. Let's face it, he probably doesn't maintain as many as his family did. The tortoises are still there. Now, I thought this would drive them to extinction, but this land has been grazed by this same stock of cattle by his family for over a century, and the tortoises are still there. So why didn't they go extinct? I thought that it would hurt the tortoises. In reality, what's going to hurt the tortoises is when the entire area becomes one solid sheet of solar cells and there are no more plants there. That will cause desertification because it's not actually putting biomass back into the soil, as any biologist or agronomist will tell you is the case when you ranch land. If you've ever been in a cow pasture, haven't you noticed how nice and squishy and brown and goopy the soil is and how wet it is? And it's really nice, and the grass grows extra green in a cow pasture, whether the cows are still there or not. For years afterwards, it's nice and healthy. Stepping in cow pies might not be all that fun to do, but you look at it and it's full of flowers, there's daisies, and it looks like a scene out of Switzerland. It's all nice and green and healthy. Haven't you noticed this? That's because the cattle recycle biomass. It's a recycling system. These tortoises are eating biomass and shitting it back out onto the prairie. What is the difference? The cows are not competing for the same types of things that the tortoise is. Totally different niche. But apparently this goes beyond. Apparently the feds don't understand this because although they hired these biologists, the biologists are on their payroll, so they're going to tell them what they want to hear. Shame on them. I've studied the same thing, and I'm telling you, The cows will not damage this land. Windmills might, and putting 4x4s in there to maintenance the windmills might. This rancher with his, he's probably riding horseback for all we know, like he's still in the 1800s. He's not damaging the land, especially not with a fairly small group of cattle. That 900 may sound like a lot. It's actually not, compared to some of these factory farms that have tens of thousands of heads of cattle. Federal officials tried to round up Bundy's livestock 2 years ago, but he refused to budge. Since then, he has lost 2 federal court rulings, and a judge last October prohibited him from physically interfering with any seizure or roundup operation. The cows are still his property. And I'm not sure how large his actual holdings of ranch land are. Probably quite sizable. Taxes in that area are presumably fairly low. If they're on his land, that's trespassing when the feds come on it. But of course, they're federal agents, so nobody cares. When threats are made that could jeopardize the safety of the American people, the contractors, and our personnel, we have the responsibility to provide law enforcement to account for their safety, National Park Service spokeswoman Christy Vanover told reporters Sunday. How is it endangering the American people? What, the cows are going to suddenly go stampeding through a city and crush people to death? The only danger here is that these federal agents are all heavily armed and presumably ready to fire on him and his family, and probably the cows too if anything gets out of hand. And now the militia is going in, and now the state representatives here and even the governor are against the Fed. So you could see, a massive fight on your hands over this one ranch. The trouble started when Bundy stopped paying grazing fees in '93. He said he didn't have to because his Mormon ancestors worked the land since the 1880s, giving him rights to the land. Technically, yes, at least in some states. Years ago, I used to have 52 neighboring ranchers, he said. I'm the last man standing. How come? Because BLM regulated these people off the land and out of business. Well, I'm not surprised, because, yes, they like to grab land. It's happened before in the past, and you look at a lot of these projects and they never come to fruition. They go bankrupt because the government doesn't know what the hell it's doing. Even state governments know better how to handle things than the federal government does because they don't have any stock in it. They don't care. They're just spending it on pet projects that they happen to want to construct. So, while I'm not going to suddenly take an assault rifle and go down to Nevada, I can at least feel sorry for this dude because his family's been there for an extended period of time. It was public land anyway that nobody cared if he used. And these tortoises that are being used as a scapegoat are going to go extinct anyway. They're going to get killed because they're going to come in with 4x4s and dump trucks and start building a bunch of windmills and thermal solar projects. I don't know if by that they mean Germany pioneered that technology there where they've got that huge tower with the liquid sodium in it and they aim mirrors at it and it provides a huge amount of heat and electricity. It is a good technology, by the way. Or whether they mean like, solar cells. We got a bunch of them around here. Anyway, I'm not sure which they're talking about, but either way, it's going to destroy some of this habitat. And the biologists themselves are saying the tortoises are going to die. Well, then why do you care if Clive ranches this land while you're busy building your project? If the tortoises are going to die anyway, let him ranch it until you build these things, and then tell him to leave. You don't need to go after him 2 or 3 years in advance simply because you want him off the land for when you start building these windmills and so forth. It doesn't make sense. I think that organizing these Nevada militia groups might be seen as a little bit intimidating to these federal agents too, because remember, most of these federal agents have never been in an actual combat scenario. Some of these militia people are veterans. They have been in combat. And they will go apeshit when the shots start firing, and they will mow down the federal agents much more effectively than anyone at Waco possibly could have done with their sort of weak training. So, it could escalate into a particularly bad, bloody situation, which would be amusing in many ways because it would be funny to see how someone like Obama reacts to talk about my tortoises when it's clear that the tortoises are not the reason for this land grab in the first place. I think with Operation America, and here's one thing I will say. Pete Santilli from Operation American Spring is planning to show up there. He's going to make the situation worse. Just like he fucked with the Truckers for Freedom or whatever the hell it was called movement. Operation American Spring. I've already made a video on that. It looks like a honeypot to me. If not, it's completely delusional. The very idea behind it is unconstitutional. How do you replace an unconstitutional government properly by subsequently violating the Constitution and ousting it? I'm not sure. To him and his Zionist partner and his former NSA partner, the three people who have organized this project, I guess this makes sense. If I was this rancher, I would tell Santilli to stay the fuck away from my ranch, or I'd be firing on him first before I focus on the feds, if any situation did develop, because Santilli has poisoned any of these patriotic movements. You need real libertarians. You don't need some rhino, some jaded GOP member who still thinks Ted Cruz is honest, leading such a movement. It does not make sense whatsoever. It makes even less sense than the Fed's arguments about the goddamn tortoises. This is not about tortoises. This is about an up-and-coming solar and wind project in this same location that will drive these tortoises to extinction and involves 1.8 million acres of land. 1.8 million acres. It's an enormous area that's going to be developed. And these tortoises are going to be driven forth very slowly because they're tortoises, and they'll have to wander out into the hinterlands and find new land to graze on, or do whatever tortoises do. I don't even know what the hell they eat, fruit or nuts or something. Maybe they eat sand. Maybe they're like that. I'm just joking. But anyway, no, I feel sorry for this rancher. It must be a tough situation for him. His son gets jailed for filming these officers. He's being surrounded by heavily armed, essentially militarized federal agents. Then the militia's coming in. Pete Santilli is going to come shill it up on his ranch and probably start dancing around, chanting hoodoo and grabbing all the attention and saying, "We're fighting for our Constitution. Remember to sign up. Remember to give us your personal information for Operation American Spring." It's a great idea. I promise it's not a federal honeypot. Ridiculous. Completely overblown situation. The federal government is handling it very poorly. It's pretty bad when the state, this is Nevada, by the way. This is a state that went for Obama. So you can't say that the population of the state is just composed of, racist rednecks that want to cling to guns and Bibles. This is a marginally blue state that went for Obama. And I'm sure that the sort of authoritarian left, just like the authoritarian right in the media, will say, well, it's the Republicans trying to hinder our green energy project and trying to kill off the tortoises that we ourselves will subsequently kill off when we develop this land. Very ridiculous. That's about all. Peace out.